series this afternoon on the 14th of August 2020. I have in my hand a remarkable eyewitness account of the children landing. It was written by somebody in the immigration office based in Liverpool, and he travelled to Crosby-on-Eden. And the report is called Party of Jewish Refugees from Prague. And I'm going to read this out because for us it's a wonderful document. Word being received that the expected movement of 300 children from Prague was likely to take place on Tuesday the 14th instant, the first plane being expected to land at Crosby-on-Eden at 2 p.m, I proceeded to Carlisle on the afternoon of the 13th, accompanied by Mr. Slade. Arrangements having been made for Mr. Bain from Liverpool and Mr. Duthie from Heysham to travel up the next morning. It was confirmed by telephone next morning from the aerodrome that the first of 11 planes was expected at 2 p.m, but that there was some doubt as to whether all the machines would make it as the weather was worsening. There being very little in the way of transport facilities at the aerodrome, the adjutant regretted he was unable to send a car for us. There is a sparse bus service from Carlisle running near the aerodrome, and it was necessary to wait 2 hours and 10 minutes until 11:50 a.m. for the next bus. The aerodrome was found to be a large one, and the buildings, huts, temporary and well dispersed, there being literally miles between them. The adjutant kindly drove us in his car from his office to the mess, where we were given lunch. After this, we walked 3/4 of a mile to the control tower, where we learnt that the first plane had given an expected time of arrival at 3:45 p.m. From here, we were given a lift in a van to the hut where the passengers were to be examined, a distance of about 1.5 miles in yet another direction. The station commander had detailed Flight Lieutenant Balfour to make the arrangements required. The hut allotted was one of 5 rooms with a door into the middle room and another at the end. This hut was expected to accommodate the RAF medical officer, ourselves, security, customs and the WVS canteen. There was no electricity or other means of lighting laid on in the hut. Fortunately, it was a very fine day. The customs at once decided to set up their table outside the hut. Seeing the impossibility of checking the children inside the hut, I arranged for a table to be set up on the grass beside a path. I asked the medical officers whether they thought they could do their inspection in the open air, taking any child needing a particular examination into the hut. To this suggestion they agreed at once. Miss Jones-Stiebel, the Assistant Secretary of the Jewish Refugee Committee, with helpers, was present to look after the passengers. The Army had provided buses and lorries to transfer the passengers and baggage to Windermere by road, the original intention of using trains having been abandoned. The medical inspection arrangements were somewhat nebulous. The RAF medical officer was interested, but the Air Ministry instructions on the medical inspection of passengers arriving at RAF aerodromes seemed not to have reached this aerodrome. To some extent, this may be accounted for by the fact that the MO was there on relief only, yet he had never seen the instructions. I was able to show him those sent to us, for which he was grateful. The medical officer for the district in which the hostel to which the passengers were proceeding is situated was represented by Mr. Eric Crutzen, JP of Kendal. The customs had independently informed the medical officer of health of the border rural district in whose area the aerodrome is situated. He attended and assisted the RAF MO. The WVS had to use 2 rooms of the hut in which to set up their tables and urns. I took the middle room with the entrance door for the examination. For the adults, Messrs. Bain and Duthie functioning there with the security officers. The first plane arrived at 5 p.m. The 2 adults and 30 children were mustered and escorted to our centre in an orderly group. They were checked by Mr. Slade with the list and seen by the medical officers. The adults passed into our room, the children filed past the customs officers and then into the WBS canteen for food and drink, out again into the open air to eat and await transport. They were put into a bus and were away before the second plane arrived at 5:50 p.m. Unfortunately, this second plane carried a stowaway, a boy of 15 who claimed to be a Polish Jew and gave his name as Icek Koroniczki. There was some evidence which suggested he might be a Soviet citizen. The medical inspection was based on knowledge that the children had been in quarantine for 3 weeks. The presence of this unquarantined boy upset calculations, and it was desired by the medical officers to segregate him for observation. Miss Stiebel was ready to accept responsibility for him. The planes began to arrive at shorter intervals, the third and fourth together at 6:20 p.m, and congestion appeared inevitable, there being over 30 persons on each machine. However, I was able, with the assistance of all concerned, to keep the passengers in groups, and despite the lack of facilities, everything was kept orderly. Some of the adults were elderly people in the 60s and 70s, and these were provided with seats and given food and drink by the WBS until they could be dealt with. The last adult passenger was cleared at 9:10 p.m. with the final aircraft, when it was quite dark in the hut and all the passengers remaining on the airfield were ready to leave by 9:15 p.m. But the army had miscalculated and there was insufficient transport. There were some 30 children and 2 adults left and no bus remaining. The adults and half the children were put into an army lorry, the only remaining vehicle, which left at 9:30 p.m. Mr. Duthie went by the previous bus in order to get his train for Heysham at Carlisle. Mr. Slade left at 9:30 p.m. in a security van for Carlisle. Mr. Bain and myself, Mrs. Nathan of UNRWA, Miss Stiebel and her assistant and some 15 boys were left on the airfield in the darkness. We were told by the army captain in charge that we would have to wait only about 5 minutes. A little later it was learned that he had to get transport from a depot in Carlisle, and it was turned 10:30 p.m. before a lorry came to pick us up. Although it had been a fine day, it was very cold and windy on the aerodrome at dusk, and we were all very cold. We actually left the airfield at 10:45, and Mr. Bain and I left the lorry at Carlisle. We, and the other staff concerned, were without a meal from lunchtime until we arrived back at our hotel at 11:30 p.m. We had, it is true, been given a cup of tea and a cake by the WBS at about 4:30 p.m. It was understood that all the passengers, including those in the last lorry, were to be conveyed by road to the hostel at Troutbeck Bridge, Windermere, that night. I'll skip a little bit to come to the end, which is interesting. It was originally intended that 23 planes should be used, carrying about 16 passengers each. But weather conditions were such that it was found possible to send only 11 of the machines that day. And in order to complete the movement, it was decided to put double the number of passengers in each plane, one actually carrying 44. But in this case, many of the children were very small. 10 machines actually arrived with passengers, the 11th being used for carrying the baggage. This last machine was unable to complete the journey and had to return to the continent, Holland, for the night. All the passengers having been accounted for, I decided it was unnecessary to visit the aerodrome again the next day. And his final comments. I conclude by repeating that it was fortunate that the weather was fine. Had it been wet, the accommodation provided was useless in the circumstances of the landing. The cooperation between all the parties concerned was excellent, and the behaviour of the children was exceptionally good, all instructions being immediately obeyed.